Students, let's continue with our yesterday's topic, that is W.H. Auden's poem in memory of W.B. Yeats. As I've already told you yesterday, that in this poem, W.H. Auden tells about W.B. Yeats' death and about that wintry afternoon on which he died. This is a poem. In a way, it's an elegy, uh, but this elegy is in ironic tone. It is different from a conventional elegy because traditionally an elegy, what happens? Nature is represented as mourning the death, but here in this poem, in this elegy, nature is represented as going on its course indifferent and unaffected. The great poet's death goes unnoticed both by man as well as nature. And human life goes on as usual, and so does the nature. Yesterday, I've also told you that he compares, or by using a metaphysical conceit, Auden tells that Yeats is like an emperor and the body parts his empire. So, when his body parts revolted like different provinces of an emperor, and his mind and body stops reacting, his suburbs means his limbs, his hands and feet, they became numb, and finally he became unconscious, and then he dies. He became his admirers. Then further, Auden writes that although the poet has died, but his poetry will survive because art never dies and art is immortal. Then he further says that uh, after his death, now he is scattered among 100 cities, means his works or poetry, it will be read by unfamiliar and unknown people in different parts of the world, in different countries, and Yeats will be judged by people of different countries according to their rules of art, and his poems will be evaluated or criticized or appreciated by the people uh, who are unknown to the poet himself. So, in this way, the words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. Words of the dead man means the poem or the poetry of the dead poet, it will be interpreted according to the living people, those who are living. So, now let's proceed. But in the importance and noise of tomorrow, when the brokers are roaring like beasts on the floor of the bourse, and the poor have the sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed, and each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom, a few thousand will think of this day, as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. Oh, all the instruments agree the day of his death was a dark, cold day. So, but in the importance and noise of tomorrow means everything goes on as usual. People will do what they were doing, they will continue with their work. When the brokers are roaring like beasts, brokers means the businessmen, they will be busy with their business and they'll be roaring like beasts. So he's using a simile here on the floor of the bourse. Bourse is the stock exchange. And the poor have the sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed. And even the poor people, they'll continue with their suffering to which they are accustomed, to which they are habitual. And each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom. Means, and each in the cell of himself means people live with an illusion that they are free, and each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom. This means that people are very selfish, they are self-centered, they are egoists, and they live with an illusion that they are free. A few thousand will think of this day. So it's just telling that people will continue living or doing what they were doing or how they were living. It will change nothing. Only a few thousand will think of this day. A few admirers of W.B. Yeats will remember this day as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. So, very few people will remember the day of his death when something slightly unusual happened. Oh, all the instruments agree the day of his death was a dark, cold day. And again, he repeats that it was a very cold, dark day. And all the instruments or the mechanical devices, they indicates that it was a very, very cold day. So both human beings and nature remains indifferent to his death. So instead of glorifying W.B. Yeats or glorifying his death or glorifying him as a poet, he just simply mentions about the day of his death. And in the next section of this poem, you'll notice that he goes to the extent of calling him as a silly man. So let's read the second section of this poem. You were silly like us. Your gift survived it all. The parish of rich women, physical decay, yourself. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Now Ireland has her madness and her weather still. For poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its making, where executives would never want to temper. Flows on south from ranges of isolation and the busy griefs. Raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives. A way of happening, a mouth. So in this second section, Auden, or we can say that his expression becomes more charged with psychological overtones. Now Auden seems to shift to his natural poetic self. He begins to ask more vital questions about a poet and his work. He evaluates the worth of poetry to be assessed in terms of modern psychology. And in this section, Auden expresses his opinion that Yeats was in no way an exceptional individual. He was just a common man. Silly like us means a common man with common weaknesses. And according to Auden, Yeats is silly like most of us. Then further he says that it were the in the next two lines he just tells us about the major themes of his poetry. He says the parish of rich women. Now here this rich woman is Lady Gregory. He talks about Lady Gregory. He also writes about physical decay means about death. He writes about himself and also about Ireland. So, it were the wrongs of mad Ireland and the desire to serve his people through his poetry that made him into a great poet. But now he is dead, and even the women who flattered him are also dead. But his poetry survives. Then he says, Now Ireland has her madness and her weather still. What he wants to say, what Auden wants to convey is that though he has tried to write poetry about Irish Revolution, but that doesn't helps uh, in any way. His poetry could not change the destiny of the Irish people. They still have their madness and their weather. And as a matter of fact, according to Auden, poetry can make nothing happen. Although it no doubt survives the death of the poet, but it survives not for what the poet has said, but for the way in which he said it. So it's the language or the art or the manner that is important. For poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its making, means how it is created or its manner, where executives would never want to temper, flows on south from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs. So, according to him, poetry makes nothing happen. It has no contribution in history, according to Auden. It survives in the valley of its saying, means it survives for the manner in which it is said or the manner or style in which it is written, where executives would never want to temper. Executives means the administrators could not interfere. Temper means interfere here. It flows south from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs, raw towns that we believe and die in. So he just wrote poems, and then the content is not important. It is only the style that is important. It survives a way of happening. So not because of content or matter, but because of style and manner of expression, it survives. A mouth means mouth of the poet who dies, and his style of saying things survives even after his death. So, this is what Auden is trying to uh, say about W.B. Yeats in this second section of the poem. And instead of glorifying him, he tells us that he was a very common man with common weaknesses, but his poetry survived it all, survived his weaknesses or survived him. Then he talks about the different themes with which he dealt with in his poetry. Then he says that although he has written much about Irish Revolution, but according to Auden, poetry makes nothing happen. Here I want to just add my perception or my view that literature or poetry, we can say, makes things happen, because literature is the mirror of society, and it reflects society and it also affects it. So we cannot say that poetry doesn't contributes in any way to our lives. It not only gives us pleasure for the way in which it is written, it not only entertains us, but it also provides us knowledge. It also uh, uh, instructs us. So in this way, what actually Auden wants to convey is quite a different idea, and this is the main ideas or the evaluation of the second section of the poem, and tomorrow we'll continue with the third section of the poem. Thank you.